So, relationships and MS. So, all sorts of things cause changes in relationships. You know, if you have young children and you haven't had children, if you get children and they get to the stage of leaving home, those change the relationship too. But certainly when you have a serious illness like MS, that changes our relationships in a significant way. So all sorts of things can change. Household responsibilities may change. How we socialize may become more challenging. Our sexual relationship may be affected. Finances may become tight, and there can be an ongoing worry about health. So with all these changes, there's potential for conflict about how to handle these things. Or alternatively, there may be a tendency to bottle things up. The person with MS may feel like a burden and feel guilty that they can't do more, whilst the caregiver may be reluctant to say if they are struggling with extra responsibilities for fear of seeming critical or disloyal. So I thought it would be useful for us to look particularly at some communication skills. And what I'm going to share with you next is a model about how people handle conflict, because conflict is, people tend to think of conflict as being a bad thing, but conflict is about being different. It's normal in any relationship that we're not always going to see things exactly the same way. So just before I get onto that, perhaps one of the ways I think that can be really helpful to do this is to be able to separate out MS from the person, because illness doesn't define who the person with MS is. There's much more to a person than the fact that they have MS. But the reality is, when someone has MS, it doesn't just affect them, it also affects the people who are close to them, particularly a partner and children too. So by recognizing that it has its impact on both of you, it frees you up to talk about it and discuss how you will handle it together. So it's almost like, you know, the MS is almost like a third party, if you like. So you can say, well, MS is impacting me in these ways, and the person who has MS doesn't need to feel guilty about it. And the person who doesn't have MS can feel it's actually okay to say the impact it's had on them, and then you can kind of work together as a team. So I'm just going to go on next to look at this model that I was talking about how people handle conflict. So first of all, when you have conflict, there are two things that are going on. First of all, there's the issue that you're talking about, and the other is the relationship. So if this is an issue that we see differently, you know, how is that impacting our relationship? And for some people, they're very much issue oriented. So they will, and they tend to focus more on their needs or, you know, how they see things, and they may be less sensitive to how the other person feels. Some people, it's if you like, a desire to kind of get things their own way. Other people, it's more that they're just kind of so concerned with getting the issue sorted out that they're perhaps insensitive to how they come across. But at extreme form, that's the aggressive person. The aggressive person says, it's all about me. And the advantages of being up this end is that it tends to be a powerful place to be, because you get what you want. Because the other person can be scared to kind of disagree with you. But the disadvantage of being at extreme this end is that it can be a lonely place to be, because if other people feel like you're not taking their needs into consideration, they tend to back off to protect themselves emotionally. Now, I should say that it's very unlikely, you know, very few people are going to be 100% at one end of the scale or the other, but this model just makes the point. So we're kind of looking at the extremes. So from the one extreme, for the person who's all issue oriented and all about getting things their way, you have at the other extreme, you have the person who tends to look after everybody else's needs but their own. And that's the person who tends to look after the relationship first and foremost. And its extreme form again, that's the submissive person. The submissive person says, oh, let's not fight. You know, I don't like have disagreements. They're more likely to kind of push their needs underneath. So with the submissive person, they tend to get on well with people because they're kind and considerate of them. The disadvantage is that over time, what can happen is that resentment will build up because they feel like everybody's needs are getting met but theirs. And its extreme form, there can be a loss of identity. There are some people who spend so much of their lives trying to keep everyone else happy that they lose track of what it is that they want. So then they handle one of two things can happen with this resentment. Either it sits there, either they push it underneath because they don't like having conflict and they just kind of sit on it. But eventually what can happen is so much resentment builds up that they can't kind of keep it inside anymore. And this person who is pretty easygoing most of the time will suddenly shoot up the other end, and there'll be an almighty explosion, and you'll think, where did that come from? But it won't just be that one issue. It'll be all the little niggles that have been building up until finally something is the last straw, and it may be something small, and this person will suddenly kind of will suddenly let it all out, and then the other person will think, where did that come from? But having got it out of their system, then they kind of like beat it back down the other end, and the whole process starts all over again. The other thing that can happen, though, if you tend to be submissive, is what you can do is build up a wall to protect yourself. Because if you keep being nice to people and they're not as nice and considerate back, you can get hurt. And so to stop yourself getting hurt, what you tend to do is put up this wall and to distance yourself from the other person. And the problem with that is that you can't say, well, I'm going to let all my positive feelings through and not my negative ones. It stops both feelings going through. So in the end, it's kind of like you just have this, you just become distance. It's kind of like an invisible wall grows up between you. So the ideal, if you like, is somewhere in the middle, is what we call being assertive. And the difference between being assertive and being aggressive is that the assertive person says, okay, these are my needs. What are your needs? Let's talk about it. So it's about seeing conflict in a different way. If you see conflict about win or lose or right or wrong, it actually doesn't really matter whether you win or lose, because it always leaves that horrible kind of tension in the relationship. On the other hand, if you can see conflict as about being different, then you can say, okay, we see this differently. How can we find a way that works for both of us? So instead of being sort of coming out opposite corners fighting, it's about being on the same side and trying to find a solution. Right. So these are some tips for handling sensitive conversations. Given that the idea is that what we're wanting to do is find some solutions, to be problem solving, then there are certain things that can help with that. First of all, choosing a good time and place. If it's really late at night, or maybe if you're in extreme pain, or if you've got other people walking in, or if you're feeling really annoyed, they may not be a good time to talk about things, because when we're feeling either anxious or angry, what tends to happen is that our brain releases adrenaline into our bodies to put us on high alert to try and keep us safe. But the dilemma with that is that it also means that our listening skills drop. The adrenaline is there to try and keep us safe, but it actually makes it harder for us to access the problem-solving part of our brain. And so what can happen is that somebody may tell us something positive, but because we're feeling so anxious, we may actually miss that and only hear the negative things. We're looking for the negatives and miss out anything that is on the more positive side. So choosing a good time and place is important, because we're much more likely to be good listeners when we've chosen a time where we're not going to get interrupted, when it's easier for us to listen. I know that's often easier said than done, but that's the idea. Okay, the next bit is about using I statements. Because if I say, you do this or you do that, you always leave your towels on the floor, or whatever it is I'm saying, as soon as I say, you do something, the natural reaction is to feel like you're under attack. And when we feel like we're under attack, we tend to defend ourselves, and we will defend ourselves in whichever way comes most naturally to us. So we either defend ourselves by going on the attack back and say, well, what about you? You did X, Y, Z. And then you have an argument about who the worst offender is. Or alternatively, you go quiet and retreat behind that wall. And the problem is, how can you solve a problem if one person isn't talking about it? The worst is that sometimes you have two people who are not talking about it, and problems mount up. And if nobody's talking about it, they're never going to get resolved. So if the idea is to solve the problem, and the person who's got the problem says, well, this is what's going on for me, this is my problem, then the next bit that goes with it is what they call reflective listening. So this isn't necessary for every single little problem, but the more sensitive an issue is, the more helpful this step is too. Because as I said before, when we're feeling upset, our listening skills tend to drop. So if somebody says that they're upset about something, I'm upset because you didn't let me know you were going to be late home from work, for example. And I maybe had prepared dinner and it's spoiling. I wish you had rung me. It could be that the person listening hears the first bit, that they're upset they're late, and misses the bit about ringing, that the problem wasn't so much that they were late, the problem was the fact that they didn't ring and let them know. So first of all, the reflective listening bit, it checks out that if you're going to disagree, at least you're both disagreeing about the same thing and that you have heard what the actual problem is. But the other thing it does is it lets the other person know that you care. Because what can happen is, particularly if you tend to be more towards the submissive end of the scale, your partner may raise an issue and you think to yourself, oh dear, what do I say now? Whatever I say is going to be the wrong thing. And so you say nothing. And the person who's raised the issue thinks, I've just told him or her how upset I am, and they can't be bothered answering. They don't care how I feel. And what can happen then is, because they feel that you don't care, their anger tends to rise, and they can perhaps get meaner and say more harsh things, just trying to provoke a response in the person who's gone silent. Whereas if you don't know what to say, even if you just say back, oh, you're upset that I didn't ring you, or whatever it was that you heard, the other person knows that you're willing to listen and that you have heard them and that you do care. Because if we feel listened to, we're much more likely to calm down, because we don't feel like we need to fight to be heard. Yes, you still have to sort it out, but it provides a much calmer basis, much more likely that you're going to be able to sort it out when we feel listened to. The other thing I should say about I statements and you statements is that it's the difference, when we're angry, it's about being able to process our anger and saying, what is it that I would like to change? And so if I'm feeling angry and say, this is the problem, I feel this way, this is what I want to be different, rather than this is the problem for me, you're the problem and you need to sort it out. So it's the difference between saying, I've got a problem and I'd like your help with it, and saying, you've got a problem and you're doing it wrong. And as I said before, it's much easier to respond to a request to help than to feel like you're being told off. But then it's important to recognize there's a difference between accepting and agreeing. Sometimes we can see things differently. And if it's a problem for one person, then it's a problem for the relationship. It doesn't necessarily mean that we always think they're right to feel that way. I mean, people can have different ideas, for example, about how tidy you need to keep the house. And there's not necessarily a right or wrong way around that. But if you say, okay, this is a difference between it, I can accept that you want a certain level of tidiness without necessarily agreeing that it needs to be that way. But if we're going to find a way that works for both of us, then it's about finding a solution that we can both live with. The reason for seeing it as about being the difference between accepting and agreeing is that then it gets out of that blame thing again. As soon as I say, oh, you know, you're a neat freak, or you're slovenly, or whatever, then you're back into that who's right and who's wrong stuff. But if just you can recognize that this is about us being different in this respect, then it's much more likely to be able to make a solution you can both live with. The other thing that is helpful is to avoid comparisons. Sometimes people will say, oh, you're just like your mother, or you're just like your father, or why can't you be more like so-and-so, or more like my friend's partner? And none of those things actually help. It doesn't help you to resolve anything. It just tends to make the other person feel bad. And what other people do really is irrelevant, because the solutions that you have as a couple can be unique to you. And as long as it works for you, that's the important thing. It's also important not to store things up to go bad. Again, we were talking about people who are on the submissive end. Sometimes people can think, oh, we've been getting on so well recently. This is annoying me a bit, but I won't say anything because it's all nice and peaceful. But the problem is when you don't say anything, then that's when it's likely to mount up underneath until eventually you end up with that explosion. Over the years, though, having been in a relationship for a great many years myself, you get to the stage where there are some things that you actually do just learn to live with. For example, when I first got married, it seemed to me that my husband would come into the kitchen and open every single cupboard door and leave it open. And it used to drive me nuts. Now, to be honest, he doesn't do those things so much these days. But, and the thing I should also say is that the thing that drove him nuts about me was that I often used to forget to put the car keys back where they belong. And it's often those little things. But over the years, if I walk into the kitchen now and the cupboard doors are open, I just shut them, because I feel, okay, if that's the worst thing I've got to deal with in my relationship, I'm doing really well. So I can actually ignore those things and know I'm not going to have resentment building up. So it's important to have that distinction. If I don't say anything, can I genuinely let it go? Or is it going to be a niggle that's going to add to the pile that's going to be a problem somewhere down the line? And I think the last thing is that it's important to end on a positive note. That if you have had to sort out something sensitive, even as being able to say, I appreciate your willingness to listen to me. But ideally, in the end, we need to be as good at communicating about the things that are positive about us and our relationship as we are about the things that cause us niggles and problems. So this is another little technique that can be helpful if you've got a specific issue, and they call this the DESC method. And so you see the DESC stands for describe, express, specify, and consequences. So I've put an example here. Some of you may relate to, but as everybody's different, it may not. This is just one example to kind of hopefully get you thinking. So in this situation, we said describe the behavior or situation as objectively as possible. So in this case, the person says, when tasks are done for me that I could do for myself, then the next step is to express your feelings and thoughts about the behavior situation. So the person says, I'm aware that the intention is to help me, but I end up feeling upset and useless. Specify what the behavior or outcome you would prefer to happen. I would like to be asked if I would like help so that I can choose whether to accept help or to attempt things myself. And then the last step is the consequence. So specify the consequences. And the idea of this is that the person can see it's not the benefit is not just for the person who's raising the issue, but also for them as a couple. So in this situation, the person says, then I will feel less helpless and irritable. It will feel more like being a team. So that, DESC model can be, if it's a very specific thing, can be a useful way to kind of process how you want to talk about it in as non-judgmental way as possible. And again, being able to avoid use statements as much as possible. So, like express your feelings, but I am aware that the intention is to help me, rather than I'm aware the intention is, that you have this to help me. As soon as you put the you in it, it just makes it a little bit harder. Sometimes you can't avoid it, but if you can avoid using the use and just stick to the I statements, that does tend to come across better. Okay, so this is when you've got a more complicated situation. So this is, for example, when you might have conflicting needs, because sometimes that there are situations where we might both have certain needs which seem to overlap. So I've come up with this, perhaps this idea of sorry, went back. Can I go back one? Yeah. Of socializing, because I think that sometimes could be an issue for couples when there's MS, that it can be important for the person who doesn't have MS to do their own socializing separately, as well as socializing as a couple. But it's also important for the person who has MS to be able to socialize as much as they can. But how you do that might be tricky. So first of all, we said the first step is to define the problem, and we put how to socialize as a couple when MS causes tiredness or restrictions and you may feel self-conscious. So I've just kind of put some suggestions up there, but the idea is to share possible solutions without comments. So at this stage, what you're doing is you're just both of you throwing out ideas as to how you might do this. And it says to be creative. So because even a silly solution might bring to mind a more practical one that you wouldn't have thought of if you hadn't actually thought of the silly one first. So they actually say, ideally, if you can get up to 10 ideas, that's good, because that's when you start to kind of start thinking outside the box and maybe come up with something that you hadn't thought before. So in this one, I've just kind of said things like, well, you might socialize separately, or you might do everything together. You might have a socializers separately sometimes, or you might arrange to have people to your home, for example, have potluck dinners, pizza night, board games, cards. Or you might both go out together, but you might put a strict limit on the amount of time that you go. Or you might go to friends who understand your circumstances and you feel comfortable about being able to leave if you feel the need. Or you might go to places where you know there are suitable facilities, places where it's easy, to good access to the bathroom and so forth. You might have a regular night out at a familiar place doing something you both enjoy, for example, going to a quiz night at the pub, and that's kind of like a regular thing that you do, and if you like that it's a safe thing to be able to enjoy together. And you might also come up with like an exit strategy, so think about, if I do feel the need to go, how will I handle that? What will I say? What will I do? So those are just a whole lot of possible solutions. What you would then do is you decide as a couple which of those options are unacceptable to either party and then eliminate them. So, for example, you might say, well, no, we don't like the idea of us socializing separately, or we don't like the idea of doing everything together. So anything that is unacceptable to either of you gets taken off the list. And then what you do is you say, okay, so from the ones that are left, maybe there's more than one solution that works for us, or maybe there's, there is just one, or maybe there's 2 or 3, but what you come up with between you as to which possible solutions are going to work for you. And then this is an important step, is that you trial it out for an agreed period of time. Because sometimes what happens is things that sound good on paper, when you actually get to put them into practice, they're not, there are things that you hadn't thought of, little drawbacks that hadn't occurred to you. And the temptation then is sometimes to give up. Whereas if you try it out and you then have an agreement you're going to come back and talk about it, then you can maybe problem solve around what those drawbacks are. So it's you might like fine tune it, as it were, rather than give up on it altogether. Or it may be that you say, okay, that hasn't worked, let's try something else, rather than just shelve it. So as I say, the idea is to try it out, then reevaluate it, and you might need to keep doing those last couple of steps until you actually come up with something that works for you. Right, so next, but is in terms of relationships, I guess that in any relationship, there's two key things. One is, how do we cope with the fact that we're different? And that's what we've been talking about how we handle conflict. The other thing is about what makes us feel loved and valued in a relationship. And this is about intimacy. So this is about what makes us feel loved and special. So people often kind of associate intimacy with sex, and sex can be an important part of intimacy. And there may be some issues around sex that's useful to have a conversation with your GP about, to see if there's some suggestions that he or she may have to help you with this aspect of intimacy. And it's important to keep communication open to talk about this. But somebody has said that intimacy is more like into me see. So it's like, you know, you seeing me just as I am. It's kind of like, you know me better than anybody else. You know what makes me tick. You know what my feelings are. You know how I think. And intimacy is what makes us feel close. So there's a book by Gary Chapman, which he calls The 5 Languages of Love. And he suggests that different people have different ways of expressing our love. Well, and it's lovely to express love in all of these ways, but often one or two of them are more important to us than others. So first of all, there's physical affection. So again, we're not necessarily talking about sex, we're just talking about hugs, kisses, holding hands, those sorts of things. So some people, that's one of their main way that they give and receive love. For other people, it can be gift giving. So this isn't about expensive gifts. This is more about the little token gestures. You know, when I was out shopping, I bought you your favorite bar of chocolate, or I bought you some mushrooms because I know you love them, or I picked you a flower. It's just the little token things that say, I know you so well that I know that this will give you pleasure. Then there's words of affirmation, encouragement and praise. So some people really respond well to being told that they're loved, to being appreciated, being encouraged, given you know, words that say, you know, you look beautiful, or I really appreciated that meal, or whatever it is that that the person's enjoyed. It's about that praise and encouragement. And then we have quality time and conversation. They have put it as one. In some ways, I almost think this could be two separate love languages. Some people, what really makes them feel most valued is spending time together. You know, whether it's playing board games, watching a movie together, just having, you know, just doing things where they're enjoying each other's company. And then quality conversation is about being able to talk things other than that surface level. It's about really knowing the other person, being able to talk about things that are important to you, maybe talking about how you're feeling about things. Again, not just the little bits and things that have happened today, but going at a deeper level. And we're going to talk some more about that in a minute. And the last one is what we call acts of service. So some people who maybe aren't as openly demonstrative in their affection in other ways, they can be much more practical. Their way of showing love is by doing things for you, you know, getting a cup of coffee, doing the vacuuming, doing those little things that say, you know, I'm doing this because I know you're going to appreciate it. One of the dilemmas that can be is that sometimes in a couple relationship, people have different ways of expressing love and affection. And it's important, first of all, to know what your main love language is. And they actually say often there's one or two. So it's good to know what yours are. And secondly, it's good to know what your partner's or your children's are as well. Because if we give love in the way that comes most naturally to us, but it's not the main way the other person receives love, we can kind of miss each other because it's like we're speaking a different language. And I think calling it the languages of love makes me think, you know, that even though some things come naturally, like for me being, you know, born into an English-speaking country, English is always going to come most naturally. It's still most possible for me to learn another language. And so that's where even if our partner or children have different ways of doing it, we can learn to express our love to them in the language that they appreciate the most. And that builds intimacy, that builds the feeling of closeness. So this is a model by a chap called John Powell. He says that we actually have different levels of conversation. So the first level is that cliche conversation. It's the kind of conversation where you go into a shop, say, and say, oh, isn't it a lovely day? Didn't the All Blacks do well? Just those kind of polite opening statements, which really don't have a lot of depth to them. They're just showing that you're being friendly. The next step is sharing facts, where I just tell you something that has happened that's hard to dispute. For example, I might say, on my way to work today, there was a traffic accident and I was 40 minutes late for work. It's still fairly safe because I'm telling you something that actually happened. There's not a lot to dispute about that. So you're still not getting to know me very well when I'm just reporting facts. The third step is opinions. Because once I start sharing my opinions with you, you're getting to know me a little better. Now, some opinions might be quite safe, but others may be, you might have a different opinion from me, and that might be a little bit more, making myself a little bit more vulnerable. For example, if I was go on to say, after about having been in a traffic jam, and I said, it's about time that they built another bridge into Auckland, you might say that's the last thing we need. We need to encourage people to be using public transport. We certainly don't want any more traffic on our roads. And so, there's a potential for that disagreement or for seeing things differently. When we get to expressing our feelings, then we become even more vulnerable. Because then, if I say I was late for work and I felt really embarrassed and upset and annoyed about it, and you turn around and said, well, you should have just left, got up earlier and left earlier, then I would be inclined to feel that you were ignoring my feelings, that you were just dismissing them. And when we express our feelings, we're even more vulnerable than when we express our opinions. So usually it's the people we feel closest to and the people we trust that we're more likely to express our feelings to. And of course, you're not going to be communicating at this level all the time. The other levels are important too, but it's important in our close relationships that we get to levels 4 and 5 at least some of the time. And level 5 really is an extension of level 4. It's when we start to share not only our feelings, but our needs, our beliefs, our dreams, our fears, our hopes. That's what we call peak communication. And there are some, couples even that really rarely get beyond level 3. But the relationships that have that real level of intimacy and depth are the ones who at least at some time can share at levels 4 and 5. And the good news, if you like, is that with MS, couples are more likely to talk about their needs, feelings, fears, and dreams, because they've been pushed, if you like, into having to have those kind of conversations. And because of that, there's a much greater chance of them having a relationship that is robust, close, and caring. So that to me is one of the positives, is that we can have a relationship that really does last the test of time and grows deeper as time goes by. So that's my talk, and I'm happy to have some questions. So if anyone's got some things they want to ask. Okay.
Just while we're waiting for others to post questions, Nicola,
Yes.
I've received a question which is around the role of body language and gesticulating and what that means in communication. Sure.
They say, and I don't know how they come up with these figures, that something like 60 to 65% of what we communicate is actually through our body language, and 30 something in terms of tone of voice, and about 7% in terms of the words we use. And so if I say to you, I am not angry, it won't be my words that you believe. The tone of voice and my behavior might completely discount that. However, I do think that if people have limited body movement or is affected, I think when people have been together a long time, you actually get to know. I mean, I think of even like with a young child, how parents, can understand their toddlers speaking so much better than strangers can. And that's because they know them well. And so I do think that that can make a difference when couples know each other well, that they can, even maybe when body languages are restricted, that doesn't necessarily impact them too much in a negative way in terms of their communication.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions or anything that they just want to comment on that Nicola's spoken about tonight?
I'd just like to say thank you again, Nicola, for providing what I got from your presentation. It's a phenomenal toolkit, or I see it as a tool belt of communication. So pulling out from a belt, whatever it is that I need in that particular moment. And it's really, really valuable. And adding to that toolbox, it never stops.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. I also really enjoyed it, and there's some things coming through in the chat box. So thank you for posting that you enjoyed the presentation. I'm also really keen to know if there are any couples watching together tonight. That would really help me to know if that's the case. So one question has come through: is there any form of specialised counselling for couples dealing with a chronic condition in the family life, or any counselling in general would help?
Yes, to be honest, I'm not sure of any specific counselling. I mean, I think it might depend on the individual counsellor. There is a website called Talking Works, which lists a whole lot of counsellors on their areas of speciality. There is the Grief Centre, and of course, grief can be around any kind of loss, and certainly health is a feature of coming to terms with a serious illness. But to some extent, I think it provided. It's a counsellor that you relate to, it can be helpful to talk through any issues. And I think sometimes it's helpful for individuals to talk, both the person who has MS and the person who is supporting them, because sometimes it's good for them to be able to process things separately for themselves. And then it can also be helpful for them to process things as a couple, because as we were talking before, it's good to be able to do things as a team. But sometimes it's easier sorry, I got distracted by something came up on the screen. What was I saying? Sometimes it's easier to talk with your partner about something if you've had a chance to process it yourself. So I think there can be, as I said, a reason for both doing it separately and as a couple, or to do both at times. I mean, I do some counselling. I do some work out of Browns Bay, and if people wanted to contact me, that would be fine. But as I said, there's also Talking Works in the Grief Centre, and actually Hearts and Minds has a directory of various support agencies and counsellings and low-cost counselling in the Auckland area. We have what we call a health or 2 health navigators. So that's another option where you could ring them and ask if you were looking for a particular area of help in terms of counselling or other support.
Thank you. There's another question, which is, how would you help someone who just can't seem to say what they need?
I think, yeah, it may be that's about them processing it. So it may be about being patient and just allowing the person to explore what they need. They might need to talk about a few things and explore aloud, as it were, what it is they do want. Because sometimes when we were looking at that model about being submissive and being aggressive, sometimes people, that loss of identity thing is that some people do find it hard to know what they need because perhaps they've never been encouraged to do that before. It could be also that to encourage that person to maybe keep a diary and try writing things out for themselves. Or some people are artistic, might find it easier to express themselves in painting or drawing if they can't actually, if they find it hard to put into words. Again, Hearts and Minds actually do have an art therapy type course, which some people really enjoy, and where you actually do paint, and then you're encouraged to kind of talk about how the significance of the painting to you, and that can sometimes help the person to be able to articulate something that maybe they mightn't have been able to do before they'd done the painting.
Somebody's just added to that by saying, not to stereotype, but Kiwi males are difficult to get talking.
Right. Well, it can be. I mean, certainly I think often it can be more difficult for men to talk about things than women, but I do think that's changing. And I think John Kerwin has done a lot to help with the, particularly around depression. They've just changed the name, but there was an app, Mentemia, but they've changed the name. But I'm sure if you Googled Mentemia, it will come up with a new name. But that's, he has written books, and they also have this app which they will kind of send out a little checklist for you to look at every day and give support and encouragement. So that, some people might find that helpful. I have heard of some counsellors encouraging men to talk about where, the house that they grew up in and where they were when they were age 7, and just talk about things that are familiar, if you like, just to get them going about as a sort of a technique, if you like, to start them talking about things. But yeah, I guess in the end, people need to see that there's a value in talking about things.
Thank you. And just one more general comment, which relates to one of your first slides. I heard yesterday a therapist say to refer to MS as the MS rather than my MS. It is an unwanted visitor.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yeah. Because as I say, I think, it's, you are not the MS. MS is, as I say, something that impacts you, but it impacts other people. And I think if you like, depersonalize it like that's a great idea.
Wonderful. I think that brings us to the end of our session. So just to say an enormous thank you, Nicola, for sharing your time and your expertise tonight. I think it was an incredibly useful talk. So I hope everybody enjoyed it. I'm sure they did. And yeah, thank you again on behalf of MS Auckland and everybody who's here tonight. And thank you to everybody who's taken the time as well to join us tonight.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Okay. Bye-bye.